This is Behind the Headlines, with behind-the-scenes analysis on issues affecting Pennsylvanians, sponsored by the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. Now, here's your host.
Hi, from Philadelphia to Erie and from Pittsburgh to Scranton, it's Behind the Headlines. I'm Charlie Greenawalt, Senior Fellow of the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. I'm joined as usual by my co-host Mara Donnelly. Hi, Mara.
Hello,
welcome
Charlie.
So much to the program.
Yeah, it's nice to see you.
Well, today we're going to do something a little different, but something that's very, very important in the development of Pennsylvania, and that is looking at the rural parts of the Commonwealth and seeing how they may be developing and what we may expect in the future. And we're so fortunate to have with us the best person in the state in the Commonwealth to talk about this. We are very fortunate to have with us Dr. Kyle Kopko, who is the Executive Director for the Center for Rural Pennsylvania. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thanks so much for being with us, Kyle. I think for our viewers' purposes, could you please give us a little bit of background on the Center for Rural Pennsylvania, when it was developed, why it was developed, and what it does?
Sure. The Center for Rural Pennsylvania is a legislative agency of the General Assembly. So we essentially operate as a think tank in a bipartisan manner where we serve both the House and the Senate, and we provide data and research analysis to inform the work of the General Assembly. But we also provide this information in hopes that county commissioners, municipal officials, school district directors, even nonprofit leaders in rural Pennsylvania can use information to make wise policy decisions to ensure that our rural communities are resilient going forward. So we started in 1987 at a time whenever rural and much of Pennsylvania was going through economic change. The General Assembly didn't have a lot of great data and information on which to base policy decisions specifically for rural, and that's where we came in. So we provide grants to faculty at state universities to conduct applied policy research that informs the General Assembly, and then we also maintain a comprehensive database, all different types of statistical indicators on our communities, not just in rural, but in urban communities as well, so we can engage in comparative policy analysis. The other interesting thing that the center does, we hold legislative hearings on a wide range of topics. It could be population change, which we're going to talk about today, broadband access, substance use disorder, solar development on farmland, just a whole host of different topics.
Well, you have a very interesting position. Why don't you tell us how you got there, a little bit about your background?
So my background, I'm a quantitatively trained political scientist. So I went to Elizabethtown College for undergrad, then I went to the Ohio State University for graduate school. You know, it really drives Pennsylvania policymakers nuts whenever I insert the article, but we're kind of forced to do so. And I was a political science professor at Elizabethtown and an associate dean for 10 years. And then at the end of my term, this opportunity was brought to me at the General Assembly, and I threw my hat in the ring, applied for the position, and it was really a great opportunity to work with faculty at our state universities, so blending my past background in higher education, but also my research background as well, working with data and translating it in a way that is useful for a wide range of public consumers.
How exactly are you tied to the legislature? Could you talk a little bit more about your relationship with the legislature and how that works out in terms of state policy making?
Sure. All of the individuals in my office, we're all employees of the General Assembly. We're kind of an unusual arrangement. We have a board of directors that provides oversight, and it includes 4 legislators, a bipartisan group from both the House and the Senate. Our chairman is Senator Gene Yaw from Williamsport. Our vice chairman is Eddie Day Pashinsky from the Wilkes-Barre area. We also have Representative Dan Mal and Senator Judy Schwank as our other legislators. There's 2 gubernatorial appointees as well.
Let me interrupt you right there.
Sure.
How are those legislators determined?
Great question. So the officers of both the Senate and the House make those appointments. So it's up to the Speaker of the House and the President pro tem in the Senate to make those appointments.
Well, you were in the middle of a thought there about...
Sure. We also have 2 gubernatorial appointees as well. And the other 6 members of our board all come from higher ed. So we have representation from the PASHE system, the Penn State system, and the regional campuses of the University of Pittsburgh system, and the president of the Northern Pennsylvania Regional College. So I really think that's a distinctive blend because it really emphasizes our research focus in trying to provide objective data to Republicans and Democrats, any political stripe, so that way communities across Pennsylvania can make informed policy decisions.
Well, speaking of data, you have a very recent study on population projections in Pennsylvania. I found it fascinating to see where we're headed. It's not necessarily in a good direction, but it's not bad. It's not bad. So why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the key findings of your new study?
Sure, and I'll back up and say, to your point, a lot of this seems like it could be dire. It could be bad news, but there's definitely some silver linings in the data. And it's really important to keep in mind that a lot of the trends that are projected out in our reports happen because of large macroeconomic trends that have been ongoing for decades. So this isn't anything that's happened overnight. It's not the result of any single policy, gubernatorial administration, federal policy, you name it. This is a larger phenomenon that affects more than just Pennsylvania.
Oh.
Okay? So what we're projecting is that by 2050, Pennsylvania's population growth will slow considerably, okay? This is across the board in Pennsylvania, although there's going to be some variations in regional population change. I'll get to that in a second. But what we're forecasting with our partners at the Pennsylvania State Data Center at Penn State Harrisburg, that the rural population in Pennsylvania will decline by about 6% by 2050, whereas the urban population will increase by about 4%. Now, just for context for listeners and viewers, we classify a rural county and a rural school district based on population density. So if you're below the average statewide density, you're classified as rural. At or above that, you're classified as urban. So if you use that definition, there's a lot of definitions out there on what is rural or suburban or urban. We just keep it simple. Rural, urban.
Well, that's where I had questions when I first looked at some of your material, because normally in this sort of analysis, don't we have the presence of suburbs, and we look at rural areas, urban areas, and suburban areas. How do you treat suburban areas then? You just must clump them all into urban.
For the most
areas.
part, statistically, that's what it ends up being. So it's a way of comparing rural versus everything else. So you would have your suburban and urban areas. So Philadelphia obviously would be considered a urban county by our definition, but also a place like Cumberland County or Lancaster County or York County would be classified as urban because their average density is above the statewide average, whereas a place like Potter County or Perry County would be considered a rural county.
How do you justify that? Because this flies in the face of prior studies and the way that this type of subject had been analyzed. I've not been used to seeing just rural and urban.
Well, actually, the Census Bureau has had a dichotomous definition for many years, and we relied on their definition of rural and urban up through about the early 2000s. And then with some of their definitional changes, we got some odd county classifications that just didn't quite make sense, where maybe that definition worked well at the national level, but not necessarily at the state level. So we convened a focus group of academics and community stakeholders, figure out what is the most simplistic way of determining what is a rural community. And whenever you look at the data, not to say that all of rural is the same, but you see a lot of similarities in the overall data in terms of the demographics, household income, things like that. So it's our really easy way of distilling what is rural first and foremost, and really keeping the focus on rural communities.
So let's get back to your study. So you indicated that by 2050 we're going to see some changes both of rural and urban. And you did mention that we're not alone. So let's talk a little bit about, are we failing miserably like other states? Are we successful? How are we ranking?
Well, this is all relative, so let me start there. Back up, between 2010 and 2020, Pennsylvania's population overall grew at 2.4%, okay? I know I'm throwing out a lot of data, 2.4%. By our projections here with the State Data Center, by 2050, Pennsylvania's population will slow its growth rate over that 30-year period to just 1.6%. So we're seeing slower growth in the next 30 years than what we had seen in the past 10 years. Now, we're seeing similar trends in Western New York, Ohio. For example, Ohio completed their own population forecast out through 2050. The entire state of Ohio, by their measures, is supposed to decline by 6%.
Oh, and
So
we're at
across,
1 point.
and we're going to grow by more than 1 percentage point based on these forecasts.
Okay.
We don't have great data on West Virginia at the entire state level, but the Western Interstate Commission on Higher Education typically does forecasts on the number of high school graduates in every state. This is meant to be a way for higher ed institutions to forecast enrollment trends into the future. So for West Virginia, they're projecting between 2019 and 2037, West Virginia's high school graduation population will decline by 24%. It's not that students aren't graduating, it's they don't exist. And that's what we're seeing across the board, not only in the United States, but in our region and in our Commonwealth. We're having smaller families, so our birth rate is down, and the baby boomers are comprising a larger segment of the population. And because of that, and with an aging population, fewer of those individuals are going to be in the workforce. We're going to have fewer young people behind them to take over for some of these very important roles and jobs in our community, which is why we're trying to get policymakers to understand the implications of demographic change in Pennsylvania, what it could mean for our Commonwealth going forward.
Is there an exodus going on as well? Are we seeing any sort of just migration out of Pennsylvania in addition to the birth rate and aging community?
You definitely see some movement outside of Pennsylvania, but even within Pennsylvania. So we are seeing some population shifts to the southeast, as you might imagine. And by the southeast, it's not just Philadelphia and the collar counties. We're talking about Philadelphia maybe as far west as Franklin County. So basically, if you look at I-81, I-78, that's a very rough proxy here. But if you're to the south or the east of those transportation corridors, odds are those counties and municipalities are growing historically and projected to grow also into the future. What we're also seeing, particularly in the eastern part of the state, and some of the most recent data that's been released by the Census Bureau, is an influx of individuals from the New York, New Jersey, even Philadelphia suburbs into parts of eastern Pennsylvania, into the Poconos, maybe even some migration into Pennsylvania, into places like Adams County from the Baltimore and Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. Now, what we're hearing, though, from our stakeholders on the ground and what some of the preliminary data suggests is these are later in life professionals. So it might be folks who are teleworking, or they have sufficient retirement savings where they're undertaking a new career, maybe working independently, starting up their own business, and coming to Pennsylvania for that. Don't get me wrong, that's population influx that can be good, but then there's a big question on whether or not they stay, and then what are the implications of that influx of individuals outside of Pennsylvania coming into a rural area. What does that mean for the local economy?
Okay. Well, so you've heard it here. If you have any questions about rural Pennsylvania and anything that's going on in rural Pennsylvania, the Center for Rural Pennsylvania is the place to go and look for that information and the answers. And we just started to scratch the surface of this subject and your wonderful report, and we have to ask you to come back in the very near
Happy
future.
to do it anytime.
We'd love to have you back. And we'll be right back after this message. Stay tuned.
Behind the Headlines is brought to you as a public service by the Pennsylvania State Association of Township Supervisors, the largest, most influential municipal association in the Commonwealth. Since 1921, PSATS has been preserving and strengthening township government and securing greater visibility and involvement for townships in the state and federal political arenas. Covering 95% of Pennsylvania's land mass, townships represent 5.5 million residents, more than any other type of political subdivision in Pennsylvania. Additional underwriting provided by the Edward H. and Jeannie Arnold Foundation and by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business. Behind the Headlines is also supported as a public service by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Visit pahighwayinfo.org.
Welcome back to the second segment of Behind the Headlines. On this segment of Behind the Headlines, I'm joined by Guy Ciarrocchi. Guy, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Charles.
Oh, you're welcome. Guy, you are the Senior Fellow for the Commonwealth Foundation. You're a columnist for Broad and Liberty and for Real Clear PA. You are the former Chief of Staff for the Lieutenant Governor Cawley. And you were earlier, you were the Deputy Attorney General of Pennsylvania. You have a long list of accomplishments and a long history of in politics in Pennsylvania. So we're so honored and so just so grateful that you would come and join us today.
I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, we wanted to talk about something that has been in the news for many years now. It's not going to go away. Perhaps it's subsided a little bit at this point, but it's the whole issue of monuments and statues and what role do they play in our history. And you wrote a very wonderful piece, I thought, about the whole controversy involving William Penn at Welcome Park in Philadelphia. Could you tell our viewers what happened, what ignited that particular situation?
Sure. So we're all familiar with the national stories about Washington and Jefferson, but here in our own backyard in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, there was suddenly this push to remove William Penn's statue from a park dedicated to the founding of Pennsylvania and William Penn. And to me, it seemed, not only offended me historically, but just violated common sense. I mean, why would you remove William Penn's statue from a park to welcome people to Pennsylvania, a state named after William Penn? And under the silly, if you will, I don't know how else to say it, I wish I had a more collegiate word, but under the silly idea that William Penn was offensive, a man who established a commonwealth to create a haven for religious liberty and tolerance. If you're offended by William Penn, you're probably offended by a lot of other things that you shouldn't be offended about.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, that park, Welcome Park in Philadelphia, that is comprised of the area in the yard where William Penn's home was built in Philadelphia when he first arrived in, was it 1682? So that was so surprising. The statue of him is a replica of the statue that's on the top of City Hall.
Yes, correct. Again, it's the whole idea of celebrating our history and celebrating our founding with someone who, while all of us are flawed, but as a founder is really regarded as not only someone who established a good city, but established it in a way that invited tolerance and collegiality and really laid the bedrock for the city of brotherly love. And to me, it is, sort of woke politics gone amok when you get to the point of saying that even William Penn should not have a statue, so that people visiting Philadelphia, the people visiting Pennsylvania, should somehow forget or try to cast aside the very person that created this place, that ultimately becomes the cradle of liberty, becomes the nation's first capital. To try and hide him from history is a grave mistake.
And the interesting thing is there were many of the Native American tribes who did not ask for this to occur and actually support the preservation of the Penn statue right where it is.
Sure, and again, it's something that, if you walk into a Sheetz and talk to the people standing in line, no one's clamoring to get rid of William Penn. I mean, he's just not someone that people are bothered by. I think we're living in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And so that this was not really at the assistance of historians. It was not at the persistence of Native Americans. It is really woke culture run to its extreme. We're a group of bureaucrats who live in an echo chamber that suddenly have decided that this nation's founding is something we should apologize about. And that Jefferson and Washington go aside. And if you continue down that path of destruction, you eventually get to William Penn. And then you realize that for many people, they would just as soon forget the whole founding of this nation and all of the people who helped get us where we are.
And the people who had this idea actually were individuals with the National Park Service, isn't that correct?
Yes. And when eventually folks like you and me and folks watching at home, and again, people standing at Sheetz or in Wawa, where I come from, when enough people rose up and said, this is just really flat out goofy, the politicians, the senior level politicians came out of the woodwork and said, no, this was a mistake. It was just a draft, and this should not have happened. And I'm glad they fixed it, but it should never have got to it. And I think for the viewers, we should understand that this is where the natural progression of sort of woke politics, this idea that America is inherently flawed and that we should apologize or forget our founders. No one ever said our founders were perfect, but to not recognize the important contribution they made to Philadelphia, to Pennsylvania, and the United States is just flat out silly, not only violating any idea of understanding history, but it's just silly. And thank goodness everyday Americans stood up and said, this is too far.
Yeah, the National Park Service responded by saying this was a preliminary idea and it was prematurely released, and that was all a mistake, and they backtracked on this. But if there are a good number of politicians, such as Brian Cutler from Lancaster County, had not stood up, and others, would it have occurred? Would the National Park Service have gone ahead with it?
Sure, right. The political equivalent of oops, asking for a mulligan. Look, as you know from your experience in government, is that when something goes wrong, it's always the staff's fault. The staff went rogue. When anything wonderful happened, it's because of the wonderful leadership. So the wonderful leadership stepped forward and said the staff had gone rogue. And again, my objective in writing my column was not to attack any one person or institution, but say that as a culture, we are letting this politics of wokeism get out of control. We should be able to have a debate. No one has ever suggested that William Penn or Thomas Jefferson were perfect. But to not recognize the positive, the overwhelming positive contribution is ridiculous. And to suggest that somehow their statues should go away. Again, we read about how at the University of Virginia there was a push to remove Thomas Jefferson's statue. At the very university he founded. That comes forward 2 years later to William Penn's statue should be removed from the Welcome Center in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, in the city of brotherly love. And again, when we say this, we smile, but it comes from a mindset that says that America is flawed and its history should be forgotten or ignored. And that's just fundamentally wrong. It doesn't pass the straight face test. But we have to speak out, and we have to push back, because we have to say this is too far. Our history is something to be proud of, and more importantly, it's something to pass on to our children, not to hide away.
The interesting thing is the Philadelphia Inquirer at that point, when this first emerged, was willing to issue an editorial that said, well, we don't really visit that park very often. We can see William Penn on top of City Hall. The state is named for him. That's enough. Should just move on. Do you remember that editorial?
Oh, I do. The irony in those things is I can even hear it in your voice, is that the idea, the silly argument that we can remove the statue because no one really sees it can be turned on its head. The statue should remain in place because it really doesn't offend anyone because most people don't see it. Again, the idea of removing Thomas Jefferson from the University of Virginia gets us to William Penn should be removed from Welcome Park. Gets us to eventually we should remove William Penn from the top of City Hall, which eventually gets us to we should change the name of the Commonwealth. Because if you start down this path where we stand in judgment 300 or 400 years later and look down our noses at these folks and reveal all their flaws, and that somehow is a justification to pretend they didn't exist or to recognize they're good, we get to stuff that's just flat out goofy. But it's not just goofy, it undermines us understanding all the good, all that was right, all that is special. William Penn founded a commonwealth built on religious tolerance, on inclusion. One of the really bedrock principles that invited the United States of America, out of many, one. Religious tolerance breeds the mindset that leads to the Declaration of Independence. To forget about William Penn is to somehow suggest you should forget about the founding of America. And most Americans are not going to sit back and let that happen.
And he cooperated with the Native Americans in a way that no other leader of any colony did. And the Native Americans, even to this day, remember him for that and appreciate the approach that he took on dealing with them and interacting with them. So that's why it's this whole incident was just so surprising. But then there are other statues in Philadelphia that have attracted some attention. Christopher Columbus, we find former Mayor Frank Rizzo, and then there was also, by golly, there was also Kate Smith out at the Spectrum. Is this something that Philadelphia has become focused on? Are they focused on statues now?
Well, again, much like with William Penn, I think most of us living our lives are living our lives. We're going about our day-to-day business. It's sort of this woke culture run amok that begins to step back from 2024 or 2023 social mores, social ideals of a small percentage of our populace that say if you don't fit into a certain box, we should pretend you didn't exist. And the idea that we should only honor perfect people. If we're going to start having statues only for perfect people, there'll be no statues. There should be no statues in Rome or Greece or Egypt. The idea that you don't get a statue unless you're perfect is silly. And the idea that we need some woke police to go around and remove these statues is ridiculous. They're part of our history and part of our culture, and they're an integral part of it. And to remove them is to suggest that our nation is flawed and we should be embarrassed. This is a good but imperfect nation. We should celebrate our history.
If we were only going to build statues for perfect people, there was only one perfect man who ever lived, at least in my estimation, and probably yours as well. So, yes, and we find this also. You mentioned Jefferson. Just as a parting mention, the city of Charlottesville has emasculated its history recently. If you're planning a trip to Charlottesville in the spring to see the beautiful dogwood, you may want to reconsider it, because almost all of the history has been removed from Charlottesville. They've removed the statue of Lewis and Clark. They've removed the statue of George Rogers Clark. They've removed the statue of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. And it wasn't done in a very collegial or fashion. And it's still producing lots of debate. But the city of Charlottesville is sort of the worse for wear. They have been diminished, and there's far less to see there and to honor. But that's for another program, perhaps. And maybe, Guy, you could come back and continue to talk about this. Certainly there's lots of other folks in Philadelphia to honor. Mario Alonzo has a mural, but perhaps he should have a statue. And on that, we're out of time. We'll see you next time on Behind the Headlines. Thank you, Guy, for coming.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.